I see there is just one person who's struggling a bit getting into our room. Let's see if we can manage to have everybody in. Okay. There we go. Welcome, everybody. So 6:29, perfectly on time. I think we can start. So again, welcome. We're here for the first workshop of Transitions, a postgraduate journal. As perhaps most of you know, Transitions is a student-based project. It's a journal, a postgraduate journal, and we publish every year. Well, every year. It's our first year, but we already have 3 issues out. The third just coming now in November. We help students writing on an academic fashion. We were born inside the English and Anglo-American Studies MA course, which, as you probably know, is very interested in academic writing and developing students' skills of academic writing. And so this is our first workshop, and now we are talking of creative writing. So it's another discipline, we might say. But in our issues, we also have an academic writing section. So we are really interested in that too. And I would like you to join me in welcoming our 2 guests this evening. The first one being Professor Giorgio Mariani. You probably know him. He's Professor of American Literature in Sapienza, and he teaches both the BA and the MA, both first year and second year. And then our second guest, speaker of today, Marta Trogu, a dear friend of mine. She has a bachelor's degree in English and a Master of Sciences degree in Information and Library Studies. And she will be the one leading us through today's exploration of creative writing, what it is, and how can we learn more about it. So I will gladly leave the floor to her. She will share a screen, I guess. And thank you, Marta.
Introduction. Sorry, I'm just gonna try to share this screen. Okay, can you see my presentation?
Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect, great. Okay, so I'm here today because I had the good fortune of studying creative writing as part of my bachelor degree at the Edinburgh Napier University. And creative writing here in the United Kingdom, as well as in the United States, is an established academic subject. So I think it would be nice to start with first trying to understand what creative writing is. What is creative writing in terms of what type of writing are considered creative writing, and then what is creative writing, the study and the practice of. So starting from some general definitions from the dictionary. Creative writing is described from, for example, the Cambridge Dictionary and the Collins Dictionary as the writing of novels, short stories, poems, and plays. So this gives you an idea of what forms of writing are generally conceived as creative writing. The Oxford English Dictionary gives us a bit more of an explanation, because it states that creative writing is differentiated from academic, journalistic, and other forms of writing, which are more constrained in style or scope. And I think this is important because academic and journalistic writing tend to be analytical and pragmatic forms of writing. They're generally based on qualitative or quantitative data. Differently from these, creative writing really leaves a lot of space to the writers and also the reader imagination, and welcomes in a way also the inventive element and the creative elements. Creative writing is also the term used for the actual study of creative writing, so of this form of writing and of the practice of creative writing. And in a way, we can say that creative writing as a study is the incorporation of literary studies with literary practice. So we're not just studying doing a critical study of the literary forms, which is also what we would do in a canonical literature course, but we're also trying to create literary forms. We're trying to apply these elements that we're studying in the text. Another important element of, I think, that differentiates the theoretical studies of literature in creative writing with the theoretical studies of literature in any literature course is the fact that canonicity in creative writing is replaced by a sense of usefulness and suitability. So you're not going to necessarily study the big texts of literature, the most important iconic texts of literature. You might study those as well, but you will also study texts that are more suited to understand the use of certain fictional elements, for example. So texts that are more useful to understand the theoretical concepts and to apply them. And then another important element of the study of creative writing is that you are writing for a contemporary audience, and you're writing for in a contemporary way as well. So you have to keep in mind that you have a specific modern audience that you need to address. So sometimes contemporary texts might be more useful to understand certain theoretical concepts rather than historical great pieces of literature. So yes, the theory is basically essential to the study of creative writing as well as the practice. But when you are studying the theory and when you're reading the text, you are reading the text as a writer. So with always the ending goal of actually practicing creative writing. So creative writing is an academic subject, both in the United States and also in the United Kingdom, probably in some other countries, but I'm not informed of the actual full extent of the creative writing in academia. But it is not a recent subject. It's something that has been established over the years. And I'm just going to mention a couple of points here because there is a lot to research in the history of creative writing. But just to give you an idea, it was first introduced as English composition as part of the English curriculum at the University of Harvard in the last 2 decades of the 19th century. And back then, it was basically one of the first time in which, for example, short stories and poems were accepted for credit in an academic environment. Obviously, back then, creative writing was very different from what we know now, but it started to develop from that point on. And then in the 20s, the term creative writing was first used. It was first adopted by Hugh Mearns, who was a poet and an educator, and it was a teacher of the Lincoln High School. And he decided to integrate creative writing in the English curriculum of this high school because he strongly believed in a creativist reformation of literary studies. And to push forward this creativist reformation, he wanted to encourage the natural creativity in children. By the 1931, 41 colleges and universities in the United States had adopted creative writing as part of their curriculum. And then by the 1940s, it was definitely more professionalized and the institutional structure was more defined. So it became an established academic field. Obviously, from the 40s up until now, it changed a lot. It kept evolving, it kept changing, the pedagogical approaches changed. But, that gives you an idea of the fact that creative writing is not something new. It's not something recent. It's something that has been built over a certain period of time. And it keeps evolving over time. So as an academic subject, when it was first introduced, it was introduced with the aim of looking at literature as a living thing rather than as a dead art, and with the basically aim of creating more literature or producing more literary works. And it was, and it still is, obviously, the product of the relationship between a critical discourse and a creative discourse. So, yes, it takes from a lot of subjects. It doesn't stand on its own. It takes a lot from literary criticism, from composition studies, from linguistics, from cognitive science. And what happens generally in a creative writing course is that students basically get to explore how to be a writer, get to learn how to be a writer, and have the opportunity to really anatomize and explain their own writing practice, while also following the rigorous advice of the lecturers and of the teachers. But it is definitely a distinct academic field by now. And in many English departments in the higher education in the United Kingdom, but also in the United States, you will find writers, fiction writers, or poets, and different types of writers as part of the academic staff. So in the United Kingdom, just to give you an idea of how much it's grown as a subject, by 2005, creative writing had become one of the most popular subjects in the higher education. And by 2013, there were already 50 PhD programs in creative writing emerging in the UK. So this already also gives you an idea of the different degree of study of creative writing. So we have creative writing bachelor courses, we have creative writing masters, and also in PhD programs. So there are levels of research in the subject, levels of studies. And the way it is generally organized in the United Kingdom is basically by having a weekly lecture, which is generally 2 hours lessons where the lecturer will present the theoretical concepts to the students, and then a weekly tutorial. And the tutorial, which is very common in the higher education here, is like a standard format, having a tutorial as part of the teaching process, is basically a lesson where a smaller group of students, usually between 10 and 20, meet to actually practice, they're given exercise from the lecturers, they try to practice the theoretical concepts that have been discussed during the lectures. And they also give feedback and give constructive criticism to each other in order to improve their practice. So there are lots of different courses. These are some of the ones in the United Kingdom. Obviously, I put on top the Scottish one because I live in Scotland, but you'll find many of them also in England. You can find masters as well as doctoral degree, for example, the doctorate in fine arts at the University of Glasgow. And then it will usually be always part also of any bachelor degrees in English. Often when you apply for a master degree, you have also to submit a portfolio. And this already makes you understand the importance of the actual literary production that you're expected to do. Because as part of the application process, you have to present either a 2,000 words of prose, up to 10 poems, or the page equivalent, as you can see here, from a play. This is an example of the portfolio from the University of Strathclyde, but asking for a portfolio, it is very common. It is also a way to start early an assessment process to kind of understand how the student, what the student knows, what are the practical competencies of the student, and then pick the people that are more suited to actually study in the master course. And one last thing, yes, the careers in creative writing. So I think it's not obvious. This is not an aspect that everybody, understands, especially if creative writing is not part of an academic environment. But indeed, there are many careers after a creative writing course, especially after a master. So people who graduate from creative writing courses not only become writers, but they might also become publishers or editors. They can work in journalism, they can be tutors. So there are a lot of different career paths that can definitely be taken after the course.
So I would like also to ask Professor Mariani now, since as we have seen, we are here in a very different environment than what we are generally used to in Italy as far as the academia is concerned. what I would like to ask is, do you think that this creative version of the study of narratology, as we will see later in the presentation of Marta, may be an asset to students also to develop their analytical skills, for example, because we focus, for example, in English and Anglo-American studies, we focus on academic writing as a way to express our analysis of different texts. But perhaps the practice of using the same narratological elements might perhaps be something positive, something more. What do you think about this?
Well, first of all, thanks to Marta for this interesting introduction, which I think has one of the virtues of the presentation was that it clearly showed where creative writing comes from. And creative writing comes from, as an idea, essentially from the United States of America. And I tend to look at things from a sort of literary scholar, literary historian perspective. And so I think that is one one aspect of the equation that one factor that I think we want to keep in mind. I'm not sure I know what to do with it, but I think it is one of the things that we need to take into account. And we need to take into account also that there is a wide difference, I think, in the way the university works in the UK and in the Anglophone world in general, and in Italy, and these differences relate not only to that don't only have to do with the way the university operates within itself as an institution, but also the relationship of the university to the larger society is rather different. And so comparisons are often made between these two worlds, and I think they have to be made because comparisons are always interesting, but very often people seem to ignore that we're talking about really very different worlds, especially in the relationship between the larger world and the world of the university is completely different, I think, between in the case of Italy and in the case of the UK and the United States. Just to say one very sort of basic thing that perhaps isn't related to what we're discussing here today, but I like people to keep in mind is that here you get a degree in Italy, you can't really get a degree in creative writing as things are now, but you get a degree even with a high mark in literary studies, and you don't have any assurance whatsoever that you're going to get a job anywhere. And you get a degree with from a reputable institution equivalent to the reputation that our university has, not only in Italy, but may I say in the world, in the UK or in the United States, and you're going to get a job. There is no question that you're going to get, so it is something that opens the door to a profession. It may not be, it doesn't mean that you're going to get an academic job. It doesn't mean that you're going to become the editor of, a famous publishing house, or you're going to be, hired by the Washington Post or the Times the day after you graduate. But, it is a way to a career, and that is not the case in Italy. So we have to, unfortunately, realize that, we're dealing with two job markets that are completely different. And therefore, this allows for certain things to happen in the world of the UK or the States that are hardly imaginable at this point in Italy. Now, in answer, sorry for this sort of, what looks like a digression, but I think it's something that we want to keep in mind. in answer to your question, I think that in Italy, we have to, we certainly have to do more writing. That has been my battle for the last 30 years. As you know, I am one of the few people at our university who asks for papers. You know, all my classes are, now, of course, I don't teach creative writing. I essentially try to, you know, teach my students some basic principles of academic writing, which isn't the same thing. But I do believe that, because your question had to do whether, you know, creative writing can be also useful to learning more about literature and about how literature works. And my answer obviously is yes, of course. It is a very useful and indeed powerful way to make students aware of some features of the literary text, and basically the best way to become aware of these features is when you encounter them in your own writing, when you face the problem yourself, when you imagine yourself telling a story. What is, you know, what's better than that? That to you know, begin to enter the world of literature. So realistically, I think that, you know, what can happen in the near future in Italy is that creative writing could be taught within the you know, within a literary program, and probably not as, you know, necessarily as a subject in its own right, the way it is in the UK or the States, because I'm afraid that we don't have the market that would be able to absorb these people. And probably there is also a cultural factor, and that is that I think in our world, there's still a lot of resistance to the idea that you can teach people how to write, you know, how to become an artist. I think we still have in our country a kind of romantic idea that the writer is someone who has an inspiration and follows his, you know, her or his inclinations, and, you know, you can't teach people how to become a good writer, because a lot of people think that creative writing is like, you know, teaching people to become, you know, James Joyce, which obviously isn't. You know, you may have. And, you know, there's a nice book by Mark McGurl called The Program Era, which you know, traces the birth and the development of the, you know, of the you know, the creative writing programs in the United States, and actually claims that part of the greatness of the last 7 years of American literature cannot be divorced from the program, from the creative writing programs. That, in other words, the creative writing programs are in a way you know, a kind of, and provide people with the kind of environment where good art can also develop, and not necessarily you know, standardized or predictable or formulaic, you know, kind of writing, even though there is, I think, a little bit of that too. But the claim that McGurl makes is that these creative writing programs have been very useful to the excellence of you know, contemporary American literature. But at the same time, he also knows very well that this doesn't mean that every creative writing program is going to produce every year another Thomas Pynchon or another you know, Don DeLillo, or, you know, Leslie Marmon Silko, or whatever. Obviously, some of these people may have become great writers anyway, independently of whether they went to a creative writing program or not. But certainly, the fact that creative writing is taught also in universities that do not really have a major in creative writing. But, you know, essentially, I can hardly think of a medium-sized college in the United States that doesn't offer a creative writing course, is because you know, creative writing is considered as crucial in making people understand the basis of writing in general. Then writing comes in many forms, as you know, we see here. there is journalism, there is fiction, there is academic writing, but all these things, I don't think that they're completely disconnected. I think that they're very much related. Now, if you ask me if I ever thought of becoming a creative writer myself, I never did. I know that I would be terrible at it, and I think I know what are my interests and my limitations, and or maybe also the fact that I was never daring enough to try and write fiction or poetry, except for the kind of poetry that we all write when we're teens or 20s, but and which is good that we don't publish, I think. But so in answer to your question, yes, I think it would be great, and it would be very useful. And I don't think that we would have necessarily to call the great writer to teach in a program like that. Of course, some of the great creative writing programs in the US or in the UK can claim to have really important figures teaching there, and that's part of the attraction, right? You want to study with Zadie Smith, you want to study with Jim Palahiri, you want to it's like if you want to be a soccer player, you want to learn from the from the champions, you want to steal the secrets of the greats. But basically, I think what we need in a situation like ours is people who are willing to make people understand the basics. And this is something that probably someone well versed in creative writing without having to be a celebrity could do, because there is also this factor. Who are we going to ask to teach these courses? And of course, also, do we want to teach creative writing in Italian for people who are Italian majors, or do we want to have creative writing programs, or sorry, not programs, that would be, really overreaching, but, creative writing courses in foreign languages? And which foreign languages? Realistically, some of the major languages. I assume that if you're an Hungarian major, before you get to creative writing, you got to study Hungarian for 20 years, I'm afraid. Whereas, I suspect that many of you who are not necessarily native speakers of English would be able to do some creative writing in English. But, probably it would be more difficult in with other languages. So I don't know whether I've answered your question in any way, but, I hope that, this brings some kind of contribution to our discussion.
You answered perfectly, I would say, since you have underscored what might be the positive factor in practicing creative writing, also for the analysis of literature. And what I would add is that, as Marta has shown previously, workshops and other kinds of other ways of practicing are central to at the core of these courses. So I would say that what we are doing here, and what I believe is done also in other universities and in other places, because they're not just universities, is a small step, I would say, towards that goal. And I really hope we are doing it fine. And to continue this presentation, I will leave again the floor to Marta to continue her presentation.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I shall say just a quick thing about what Professor Mariani just spoke about. I agree on the fact that they're completely different environment. UK, United States, and Italy, and all these countries. So I think that's kind of the main issue here, and the main issue for many of the artistic, I think, academic subjects that are being taught in the United Kingdom, and they don't really find a space in Italy. So I definitely agree on the point, and I think that's been the major obstacles there. Also the work life in Italy, what happens after university, and all those relationships between society and academia. So I think definitely that's something to be considered. But I'm glad we're opening this window of creative writing today, and I'm glad you invited me here to discuss this. My knowledge is just related to the bachelor degree, because that was part of my I studied creative writing as part of my bachelor, and then I specialized and I became a librarian. So I hope I give you a few useful information anyway during my presentation to start, opening a conversation on creative writing. But yes, moving on to assessing creative writing. So how does it work? In the United Kingdom, when you are in a creative writing course, the lecturer will prepare basically an assessment pattern, which is the same thing that we do in every country, in every course in the academic environment. So the assessment pattern is basically a list of specific and clear assignments that must be provided by the lecturer, and they have a specific defined credit rating, the weights on the general grade of the degree. In my case, being a degree, for example, in English, creative writing had a certain weight, but didn't have the full, so it wasn't the only mark I would get. It was one of the subjects I had to study. Sorry, I'm just gonna try to see the slide. Can you still see the slides? Okay.
Yes, we can see it perfectly. Actually, this is a great topic, since in transitions we have a creative writing section, and as we were discussing how to give credit for other training activities, we had this doubt, since we're used to have our academic writing evaluated, and so we're also used to evaluate it in a sort of way. But with creative writing, it was all another monster for us. We had to, we lacked any type of measure. And so I'm very happy that you're explaining this to us, because for me, at least, it's totally unknown how to evaluate creative writing.
Yes, I think it's probably as a topic, if you don't have creative writing as an academic subject, and if you don't perceive it as like just any other subject, really, it's really hard to figure out how to assess it. Because as Professor Mariani was saying, creative writing probably in Italy is still more perceived as a form of art, which is really hard to tell, to give a grade and to evaluate. But obviously in a different context, such as, for example, the United Kingdom, where in our case, we generally have lecturers which are actually academic. So we wouldn't have a lecturer, for example, that is a writer. Our lecturers tend to be people that have a career in the academia, and they've just worked in the sector, and also maybe published as well as. So they kind of have the theoretical knowledge that also a lecturer and a professor of literature or a literature course has. But in terms of assessing creative writing, of course, I agree that you obviously cannot impart originality or perseverance. Absolutely, you can't teach the art. But you can foster talent in an academic environment, and you can teach tradition and technique, as we already do. There are resources, so there are workshop, conferences. You'll find a lot of theoretical textbooks that you can use to learn and to teach creative writing, electronic resources, and so on, which are essential to the learning process. And they're also very useful, I think, in the evaluation process, because they give you some standards that you can look for in the text. These quotes here, I put 2 quotes here from Jenny Newman, are extremely interesting, I think. And it's just a chapter called Evaluation of Creative Writing at the Master of Arts level in the UK, which is part of the Handbook of Creative Writing. And she discusses the assessing process. And she kind of takes you through the process and how it works. And I think it's really interesting. But what she points out first is that we already have a generation of critics and of lecturers who have been assessing, evaluating writers' works, both past works and present works as well. And she also points out that we are used to judging creative writing works as part of the many book prizes and competitions that we have today. Every country has its own creative writing competitions for novels, for poetry, and so on. So we are used to the idea of having a judging panel that applies certain evaluation criteria on the works. And we're also used to see tons and tons of reviews every day on films that just came out, fiction, poetries, and plays. So it is not a completely alien concept. I just want to go very quickly through some of the creative writing, marking criteria for creative writing. And I found an example of these marking criteria in this essay by Jamie Newman, which are actually really similar to the marking criteria that we had during our bachelor degree course. These were the marking criteria for a master course. So you should know, first of all, that the marking criteria, the marking method in the United Kingdom works in percentage, and it goes from 40% up to 70%, 70+% being the highest category, so the highest marked work. And as you can tell, I'm going to leave you these slides so you can read through them if you're interested in any of these, but I'm just going to quickly go through this. But as you can tell, from this description, from this marking criteria, the best written works will be evaluated on basically four main elements, four main categories, which is the reading experience, the actual written body of the piece, the writing context, and the form. The reading experience meaning that the piece obviously has to be pleasant, has to be engaging, has to be exciting, which you might say, well, that's a subjective opinion, you know, that depends on the reader, whether the reader enjoys it. But this engagement, this excitement, the delightfulness of the piece has to be based on actual structural elements, so the actual body of the piece. So the best written works will have to present a clear tone, a well presented voice, so a well-built and developed voice, and there will need to be a clear control over the narrative strategies. Narrative strategies basically being whatever is being discussed during the theoretical classes of the creative writing course. So the lecturer will know basically what elements to look for and to check how they've been used within the work. Also, the writing context is considered during the marking process, which means that the lecturer will have to see, so there will need to be some sort of proof that the student has understood the traditions in which the piece that he has written is placed. So if you're writing, for example, a piece of Gothic fiction, like a Gothic short story, you must have an understanding of a Gothic literature, you know, and you must place your piece in that tradition. Or you might also choose to subvert it, but then it's something that if you do, you have to have a reason for doing that, and you have to, you know, do it in an intelligent way, with awareness as well. And then another important element, obviously, is dialogue, the spelling, the grammar, the punctuation, which is key also if you're writing academic writing, so for any sort of writing. So the second category is the 60 to 69%. So these are the second best work. And it's very similar to the first category. The only difference is the works that are marked with 60 to 69% won't be as coherent and well structured as the best work, and they will need additional editing to be improved. The third category, we're starting to see a few issues in the way the work, the writing piece has been written by the student. So although there is still an understanding of the theoretical concepts, there will be inconsistency in the characterization and in the development of the plot. So in this kind of like key elements of fiction writing. Then obviously the lowest category, there will be many problems in the written piece because this is the lowest grade for a pass. So there is still an understanding of the theory, or some sort of understanding of what the students should have done, of the form they should have, of the elements they should have used, but the piece is much more, is definitely weak, structurally weak, the techniques are not applied as they should have, there are mistakes in the spelling, and so on. And then the last, obviously, category, so the fail, so when a piece is not good enough to pass the exams, we're seeing not only a badly written piece, so not only a piece that, you know, that doesn't really uses the elements, like for example the fiction elements well, but also basically we are not able to understand the purpose of the author with this piece. I'm losing myself now. And so we're not really able to understand what the author is meaning and what the author is trying to achieve, and whether the author actually understood in which tradition this literary piece that is producing should be placed. And then one more thing I want to say about the marking criteria is that when I studied creative writing, we had to accompany our creative writing pieces with actually reflective commentary, which I think, especially for people that are just starting to write, is extremely useful, because the reflective commentary allows the student to show basically the process the students went through in developing the piece, allows the student to reflect on the choices made and to justify the choices made, and also allows the professor and the lecturer basically to understand where the students need help, where the students need additional support, or what elements should be, should be studied a bit better and should be covered a bit better also during the theoretical parts of the lectures. That's me with the assessment part.
So this is certainly illuminating for us, since we will, as I said before, we really lack this sort of criteria when we engage with the matter of assessing creative writing. And as you made clear, subjectivity is nothing but a single part of these criteria. There is a matter of knowing, for example, the context, knowing the literature in which you're putting your piece of creative writing. And also these elements of creative writing that you talked about, which I believe are the next subject, next topic of our presentation. Before this, I would just want to say that we will have space for questions. We will have 2 Q&A sections. The first after the first half of the next part of the presentation, and then at the end of our meeting. So if you want to ask a question to Marta or about any of the topics that we are touching today, please raise your hand. There should be a way to raise your hand through the application Zoom on the bottom part of the screen. And certainly you will have your chance to ask the question. So again, I will leave again the spotlight to Marta for the next part.
Thank you for that. Yes, okay, so moving on to the next part, we're gonna dive into a sort of introduction to creative writing, which is challenging because there is so much to talk about and we don't have much time. And, I was just wanting to do a sort of brief introduction where you would get into your first creative writing class as part of a bachelor degree. So the very first introduction. So I decided to focus on fiction writing, which I'm gonna talk about in a minute. But before getting into this topic, I just wanted to point out that really creative writing can mean many, many things. We could be talking about prose as well as about verse. We could be talking about fiction writing, about creative nonfiction, meaning memoirs, essays. Creative nonfiction also often includes, for example, advertisement, which could be a type of creative writing. Then there is poetry writing, playwriting, so writing for theater, screenwriting, writing for cinema, and what I called here different media writing, because I wasn't sure really how to explain this, but basically writing for television or writing for radio. So if you're studying a master's degree in creative writing, you're more likely going to cover lots of these topics, in details and very closely. When you're studying for a bachelor degree and you have some courses in creative writing as part of your bachelor in English, you more likely just touch a few of these topics. I personally studied a bit of fiction, a bit of creative nonfiction, a bit of poetry, and we mentioned also a bit of television writing, but you will get sort of overview of some of these formats, let's say, forms of writing. So in terms of fiction writing, what I decided to talk to you, to talk about today is the elements of fiction, and specifically 4 of the elements. So character, setting, points of view, and plotting. And as I said, it will be just a wee introduction on these topics, starting from character, because character really is the probably central element of all types of fiction, is a key element that carries the narrative, because character leads the plot, they are shaped, and at the same time they shape the setting. So they are in a very close relationship with so many other elements of your narrative. And they're also the most memorable element of your narrative, because I believe you often experience this as well, but you often, remember a book from a specific character rather than from the actual story. You remember the specific person that stays with you because you relate to that person, or because you don't relate to that person. So characters are definitely key to your narrative. There are different types of characters, of course, as you all know. You can have characters that are protagonists, antagonists, observers, key agents. So those are all elements that you, as people who study literature, who knows and research literature, you are all very familiar with. And I think in terms of character from the point of view of creative writing, the most important thing that you should keep in mind is that your character, when you're building your character, it must be believable to the reader. So you need to make sure that your character presents a complex personality, a unique individuality, a specific mannerism, because the reader will want to, live in the mind and the consciousness, and they're conscious of your character, will want to relate to your character. Which means that even if your character is not human, because you can choose to, pick animals or aliens or whatever you like for your narrative, even if your character is not human and is not believable in its form, it still must present a characterization and a personality which becomes believable to the reader. We know, for example, recently I've read L'Assemblea degli Animali, published by Naudi, where we kind of it starts talking about the fires in Australia at the beginning of the 2020, and it speaks about the first few months of the pandemic. But the whole story is told from the perspective of animals. And you can really relate as a reader to these animals because the characterization is so well done. They have very specific, it's almost stereotypical personality, almost like Aesop's fables. So this kind of shows you the importance of building strong characterization and how believable any character really can become. A character is also obviously extremely important in relation to your plotting process. You often, I think many people who have attempted to write, even just for fun, had experienced this. You often come up with a character before actually coming up with a story. As Bradbury says here, the plot is itself often the product of a character or characters in the process of development. And it's really true. So the plot really comes from the action of the character. But on the other hand, it's also true that the character itself is influenced by the events of your plot and by the obstacles that you put in your narrative and throughout your own narrative. So there is a sort of reciprocal cause and effect relationship between your character and the events of your narrative. Your character action will cause certain events, and certain events will definitely cause a reaction of your character. Meaning that if you want to develop a strong plot, which is something that we will discuss later on, but if you want to develop a strong plot, you definitely develop strong character first. Before starting to write, you have to work on your characterization. And yes, so the first advice when you're developing your character is definitely to start before actually starting to write. So work on the characterization first and then move on to writing. Your character, let me drink, wait. Here I am. Your character should be fully formed before you actually get into the writing process, because it will depend on the characterization, everything else. Your setting might depend on that. Also, your plot might depend on that. And the best way to probably start working on your characterization is to ask your character 30 questions about them. So literally imagine sitting with your character and asking your character questions. It could be anything from, this is like Julia Bell advice. She wrote a lot on creative writing and creative writing theory. But you could ask your character, what is your favorite color? But you can also ask your character, how do you feel about your parents? So ask futile question as well as deep, meaningful question to start having a full picture of the complexity of the personality of your character. And this process is called imaginative sketching, because you're basically creating some paragraphs that you might never use in your narrative, but they will be helpful for you as a writer to visualize your character and then to present your character to your reader. And imaginative sketching, we'll see later on as well, it's key to most of the elements of fiction. And it's basically the essential prep work you have to do before actually getting to write. In this imaginative sketching, and in this sort of interrogation of your character, where you ask your character a question, I think it's essential that you focus on these elements as well. So how your character views the world, meaning the society, other people, the social norms, whatever is relevant to your narrative. How your character view themselves. So are they happy about themselves? Do they regret something? Or, are they unhappy about how their life turned out? And then focus especially on fears, desires, and needs, because the way these three elements interact with each other, it's really important and is essential also to pushing your plot forward, because what your character needs might be very different from what your character wants. And we'll see later as well, we'll briefly mention this, we'll see later that from this contrast, you really can unravel a full plot. Focus on what is familiar to your character. It could be a place, it could be an activity, it could be people. So what makes your character comfortable, and also what makes your character uncomfortable because it's unknown. So it could be either information that are not known to your character, but it could also be a space that your character doesn't know, or it could be a certain experience that your character never had in his life. And then finally, focus on beliefs, the true and false beliefs of your character. And these always will influence also the way your character views the world, for example, of how the character views himself or herself. But yes, all these elements, I think, are extremely useful to start, the imaginative sketching on your character. And it's often very helpful to actually start from a character sheet, which you might have seen before. It's very common in writing as well as in role-playing games, if you are familiar with it. And it's an excellent writing tool, because if you don't know where to start, or if you're unsure about what to write, or if you just need a little push, especially now that you're starting to write, it's very useful to have these as a starting point and to reflect on the different elements, the backgrounds of your characters, as well as the personality of your character. And to go back again on what we just talked about, so the dichotomy of what your character wants versus what your character actually needs. I think that this is something that when you're building your character, and also when you're working on your character sheet, you should definitely focus on, because the contrast between what the character wants and what the character needs really adds dimension to your character. And it's what really pushes the character as well to make choices. There is a very interesting book called Creating Character Arcs by Wayland. I'm not sure how to pronounce her surname, but she speaks a bit about what the character wants versus what the character needs as a key element also in developing your plot, not just about developing your character. And she speaks about what the character wants as the surface goal, so the lie, which is basically a false belief that feeds your character desire. So the lie is basically something that the character believes about himself or about herself or about someone else or about the world, which isn't true. And the lie should be detectable and identifiable in your narrative to the reader via certain elements, via certain way the character, for example, acts. For example, via fear, guilt, secrets, or shame. So all these are elements useful to show your reader the false beliefs that feed your character desires. For example, in Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, the Scrooge's lie is the belief that a man's worth can be measured by the amount of money he has. And then this lie becomes more and more clear at every instance of conflict, and it will become more and more clear in your plot as you go along. And then obviously focus also on the truth, meaning what your character actually needs. So the real goal of your character that will help your character reach a positive resolution. And also think about what will it take for your character to actually find out this truth, and whether you want your character to find out this truth. In developing your character, you definitely have to consider also your character voice, which is key if you're going to write in a first-person narrative. But it's important in any type of narrative with any point of view, because there will be more likely dialogue involved in the narrative. And it's very important that your character voice is unique and individual. And it's very important that it will be a distinctive voice that will reflect the personality or the background of your character. So obviously, if you decide to create a character which is very extrovert, it will be a character that probably speaks a lot, that is very self-confident. If you instead, your character is an introvert, it probably won't speak as much, or it might be very rude as a self-defense mechanism. So think about all these, how the different elements of the personality might be shown into the dialogue. Equally, you have to consider the origins of your character, both geographically and socially, because these, for example, if your character is from a specific areas or from a specific social economic background, he might be using more dialects or more slurs words and slang. So you have to incorporate that as well, always keeping in mind your audience, because depending on the audience you're writing to, some people might not actually understand the dialogue. So you have to balance out all the elements that you put if you decide to put dialogue as well. And yes, and then obviously be consistent with the voice of your character, especially if you're writing in a first-person narrative, because the moment you break the illusion and you lose this consistency, the reader just won't believe anymore in your character. Another interesting element, I think, to explore when you're developing your character is the objects that your character carries. Perabo wrote, each character carries a memento of the self. And that it's very true also of ourselves as people. We all more likely have certain objects that we carry with us, either because we use them very often or because we have certain emotional meaning attached to them. So the objects that your character carries will signify something. You know, they will represent something that either habits or a vice, or they might represent a belief or the superstition. So that they're very useful to give information about your character without actually giving information about your character. Equally, you have to think about your character home. So as part of your imaginative sketching, when you're developing your character, you should probably also try to imagine your character home, whether he's living in a flat or in a house, whether the place is messy or not. Try to imagine entering in the character house and then look around in the living room, for example, and imagine what objects you see, what things are lying around, and what those objects tell you about the character himself. And then remember that showing a scene, like writing a scene of your character interacting with an object is sometimes the best way to give information to the reader about your character without actually giving information. So it's a more dynamic way to provide information. So for example, if your character is religious, you might want to create a character that carries a cross with him. Or if your character, let's say, used to be an alcoholic, you might describe a scene in which your character goes to reach for the flask in the pocket of the jacket, but doesn't find it. You know, and that kind of gives the information to the reader that the character used to carry a flask, he used to drink, but he doesn't anymore. And it goes and reaches for this flask every time he's in high stress. So you can give a lot of information without actually saying much. And then I couldn't resist but to put this scene from The Breakfast Club, because I don't know if you watched The Breakfast Club, but it's a movie from the 1985, and it's basically the story of 5 students who get detention. So they have to spend Saturday in the library writing an essay in silence. And they're all stereotypical. They're all like the typical, stereotypical character of the American high school. And one of them is Alison Reynolds, this girl on the right. And she basically doesn't speak for the first half of the movie. She says very little. She's kind of the outcast, the weirdo of the group. And then there is this great scene where she just dumps her bag and all the objects fall down, and the other students go through her objects and start picturing, start understanding a bit more her personality and how she is. And from this point on in the movie, she kind of starts opening up a bit more. And this is a great example of how, you know, you can tell so much about the character from their objects, even when they're quite silent and quite quiet throughout the narrative. And then just a couple of final advice on character development. Remember that although characterization is essential, it's not really what happens to the character that matters, but it's how the character impacts the world. So remember that that's more important. The themes that come out from the way the character impacts the world are more interesting to the reader and more engaging, and you have to think about that as well. And then I just want to finish the character section before moving to setting, to the element of setting, with this quote by André Gide. And he writes, "The poor novelist constructs his characters, he controls them and makes them speak. The true novelist listens to them and watches them function. He eavesdrops on them even before he knows them. It is only according to what he heard them say that he begins to understand who they are." And I think this is beautiful and really true. It means basically that you as a writer have to create your character, create your personality, build your characterization and everything before starting to write. But then when you actually get to write, you need to let your character be. You can't force a personality, and you can't force what you've just made into doing something that just doesn't agree with all the work that you've prepared in advance. So I think this is a good reminder to just let your character live in the narrative. And this will definitely make them also more believable. Okay, so moving on to the next elements, we're going to talk about setting. So setting, we mean the place, the time, and the circumstances in which your story takes place. Circumstances meaning, for example, the socioeconomic situation, the type of society, so anything, the how of your place and the how of your setting. You could, so setting is essential as well, just like a character. You can't write a fiction without setting. You could try to write a piece of fiction without setting, but you definitely won't succeed, because even if you did that, the writer will automatically invent their own setting using some of the information in the text, because it's impossible to imagine action and to imagine characters without time and without space. So I strongly recommend you to work on the setting before getting to write, as a second step after working on your character and the characterization. So again, work on your setting, imagine what you want, where you want to set your story, when you want to set your story, how the place looks like, and start doing the kind of imaginative sketching we talked about earlier. And start writing a few paragraphs where you actually describe the setting. However, remember that when you actually get to write and when you actually get to develop your narrative, you might not want to write block paragraphs in which you describe your setting. You might want to scatter information throughout the narrative and give the setting to the reader as a sort of cumulative work in a dynamic way. Remember also that your knowledge of the setting is definitely always going to be different from the character's knowledge of the setting. So part of the imaginative sketching work that you're going to do in building your setting will also be that of exploring how your character perceives the space and understands the space and relates to the space. For example, if you're setting your story into a city, try to imagine the character walking down a street, and just ask yourself where is your character going? What memories are revoked in your character by the buildings in the street? What thoughts pass through your character's mind as they're walking down the street? Do they know the place, or do they feel lost? What emotions is your character feeling? And work here again with the imaginative sketching and with the preparatory paragraphs before you actually get to write your narrative. And then one more thing, it's obviously remember that the setting sets the tone. So setting is definitely part of also the tradition for certain types of literature genre. So you're more likely not gonna find a Gothic fiction set in a Californian beach. You might want to try and write it, absolutely, but you know, that's not just part of the tradition. So the setting definitely is very much tied to the genre that you're going to write. And even when you pick your setting, keep in mind that you can still play around with your setting after it's been chosen by using colors, because the use of colors and the use of lights in the description of a setting is a great way also to anticipate to the reader what's about to happen. So if, for example, you are describing a room which is very light, and you know that there is a sunshine and there are golden rays of sunshine through the window, and the walls are white and the air is clear and everything is beautiful, you're probably not going to imagine a murder scene. If instead you're going to describe a very dark room where the air is thickened by cigarette smokes, and you have, I don't know, like thick curtains, velvety curtains covered by a layer of dust, you're probably not going to imagine a romantic scene there. So the setting definitely sets the tone, and also anticipates the reader what's going to happen. So you have to think about this as well. And a good exercise to play around with this, I think it's to choose some pictures. Just go on Google and select some picture of landscape or picture of interiors, or go on Instagram and select some pictures. And imagine your character in that specific space, in the picture that you found online, and then try to write a few paragraphs about how your character is feeling in that space. And this will allow you to kind of understand the relationship between the emotion and the description of a specific space. Equally, if you are going to write, equally do the reverse exercise. So imagine an emotion of your character, and after you've imagined an emotion of your character, try to, Did you text me on the Zoom, Leo? I just saw it now.
Yeah, it was before, don't worry.
Sorry. I'll stop after this section, sorry about that, just saw the chat. I was so into this. Anyway, going on. So equally, you could do the same. So imagine a certain emotion of your character, and then place the character and the emotion within the setting. So build the setting around the emotion. Okay, so setting it, this is very brief. I'm gonna very quickly talk about this because we already kind of mentioned it earlier, but setting obviously is gonna reflect the character's socioeconomic status, and it's gonna reflect the character's mind equally. So as we said earlier, your character home will give us information about your character, you know, the way the house is organized, and the way you're describing it. So it's definitely useful to use the setting to describe your character. We talked already about the value of objects as well in relation to the description of your character. What I didn't mention yet is the use of setting as a source of conflict. So setting is also instrumental in creating conflict, which is essential to put obstacles in front of your character and to push basically your character to into action, activating therefore the plot. So how can the setting be a type of how can the setting create conflict? So it can create conflict because it might be physically hard to move across. So it could literally be like, I don't know, a jungle. So it might be hard for the character to go somewhere to do something. It might be a stressful place, such as an office, for example, you know, a hard working environment. They could be an obstacle as well for your character. Or it might be something simply unknown to your character, like a large city, for example, where your character might be feeling alienated. So it's definitely something that you as a writer should keep in mind when developing your setting as well, because it's an element that you can use also to help you in your plotting. Very briefly, I also wanted to mention world building, because setting is important in all type of fiction, but obviously it's particularly important when you're writing fantasy fiction or science fiction. World building, it's, as I like to think of it, it's a setting 2.0, because there is so much more work really that you have to do to create your world, to create your reality. Because often in fantasy and in science fiction, we see full worlds, full society that just came from the imagination of the writer. So there is a lot of work to create these worlds. An example is obviously The Lord of the Rings and Narnia, but there are many, many more, as you all know. And world building has kind of its own rules, because it requires a lot. It requires double imaginative sketching that we mentioned earlier, because it requires you to kind of start picturing, first of all, how your place will look like, how the society looks like. Often, you know, we have maps that accompany this sort of fantasy fiction as well. And it requires you as a writer also to set internal rules, meaning rules, for example, about it could be magical rules if you're writing fantasy with magic, but it could also be rules of physics if in your world you're just creating a new science and new physics. So it could be really anything that governs your world. It could also be the norms and the rules of society and of the government you are depicting. You have also to keep in mind that it's fundamental to explore also the historical and societal context of your setting. So if you're building a society and you're creating your world for your fantasy fiction, you also need to kind of explore how you got there, how society got to that point, and try to understand the cause and effect relationship between the events and the social norms, and you know what it's basically why the world looks like this, you know, what has happened before and what is going to happen after. You have to understand the kind of cause and effect relationship. You have to be specific, because there is tons and tons of fantasy fiction that have so many commonly shared elements, like mythical creatures, for example. So you have to be as specific as possible, and you really have to push your creativity here and let your individuality come through, because it's very important that your fiction is different from any other fantasy fiction, that your setting and your worldview is different from any others. You have to consider how the setting puts obstacles and challenges in front of the characters. Again, we spoke about this earlier. So using the setting as a sort of conflict. You also need to leave enough mysteries for the readers, because it's a sort of collective work when you're doing world building. You know, like you want to let the reader also collaborate and contribute to the world building, leaving enough mystery for their imagination to work their magic, basically, and to make the fiction work. And then finally, diversity is essential. Our world works because it's diverse. And equally, if you're creating your own world, you have to introduce and you have to put diversity of people, of spaces, of races, of cultures, of backgrounds. And you have to think whether the diversity is honored or whether it is not. So you have to consider basically whether there are social injustice or whether, you know, the human rights are respected or not. So setting is obviously also important in science fiction. And this is just the last thing I want to say to you about setting today. And it's important in science fiction, especially because in science fiction, we often see utopian or dystopian societies, meaning that often the human rights or the lack of human rights is also reflected by the setting. The way the government works will affect the landscape, will shape the landscape. Equally, the use of technology in sci-fi will shape the landscape. So all these elements will play an important part in building your setting. For example, 1984 of George Orwell's, Bradbury Fahrenheit 451, Aldous Huxley, Brave New World. Those are all novels that show us how really you can create a setting with social and political implication. When you, for example, look at Fahrenheit 451, there is, and you look at the description of the inside of the house of the protagonist, Montag, you'll see this living room where there are these parlor walls. I don't know if you've read the book, but there are these parlor walls with these enormous television screens. You know, they occupy the full wall, and you see his wife, Mildred, basically speaking to them, calling them the family and spending her day there. And this is just a description of the interior of the protagonist's house. But from this description of this setting, of this interior setting, you are getting a sense of the manipulation and of the brainwashing propaganda of the government. So you see the social political implication of the setting. Equally, we don't really get straight away a description of the outside of the landscape in the novel, because the protagonist and everybody is always driving very fast throughout the landscape. And by the interaction of the characters with the setting, so by this fast driving, we are also getting an understanding of the social and political situation, because we understand that it is a very fast-paced society, is obsessed with speed, with productivity, and so you see how the setting works with this dynamic as well. And then finally, obviously, also in The Time Machine, you'll see from H.G. Wells, you'll see a physical divide between two areas of the setting, so the underground and the surface world, which mirrors the division, the divide between the Eloi and the Morlocks as well in society, between these different social classes. And then, yes, just remember basically that the landscape is shaped, as you can see from this quote here from Marta, and at the same time shape human imagination. And from this relationship between human imagination and landscape, you get a spiritual and political dimension. So you as writer have to keep in mind that from the interaction between your characters and the setting, you can really give a sense of the political and spiritual dimension of your novel and of your characters as well. Yes, and I don't know if you want me to pause now before getting into the point of view, maybe?
Yes, I think that perhaps if anyone has a question for you or just an example of what we have talked about right now and want to share with everybody, that would be lovely. What I can say right now is just that I was really enjoying the part in which you were speaking about different kind of creative writing, and among them, at a certain point, you named role-playing. And role-playing, well, I'm not a writer, but I have some experience of role-play, especially in D&D, in Dungeons and Dragons, and there you can really feel this creativity coming out, both as a player and as a master. For those who don't know, and role-playing, you have these two figures, the master preparing the setting, and all the characters not played by the other players, and so you really have to sketch everything from the bottom up, having the world, having all the geography, and then the political and socio-political setting is definitely hard, especially when you have a number of players doing whatever they want. So you cannot really control them. You try, but you cannot.
I agree, and I must say one thing, that I actually know people that are studying role-playing and the dynamics of RPGs in general as part of the doctoral degree, because it's a new form of literature in a way, because you're creating a narrative, but you're doing it in a completely different way, in a very interactive way as well. But it is something like the video games as well, and RPGs in general, it is something that is being explored in the academic environment now here as well.
Oh, yes, I thought it was mute. No, that is extremely interesting. Not only because, I mean, it's talking about something that I really enjoy, but also because I cannot really imagine having a doctoral degree in Dungeons and Dragons. That would be my dream. But that said, I see. Oh, I see there is a hand. There you go. We have Michaela. I'll put you. There you go.
Yes, thank you. I have a question concerning the character sketching. So all the preparation that we should put into the our imagination about the characters' different traits and beliefs and everything. And my question is for an inexperienced writer, so for someone, for example, who wants to dig in and try to write his own story or her own story, how concrete is the risk of relying too much on stereotypes when, for instance, we are creating a character and we are not so sure about how far we can go with this process of pouring our own individuality, or even if it's a character that is very far from our own individuality, but how can we avoid the risk of falling too much into stereotypes that we naturally bear with us because we have read many novels and fiction and everything. So we have a lot of characters in our mind and we risk of following their traces a little bit too much. I hope I have made myself clear.
Yeah, that was perfectly clear. I think, well, thank you for your question, first of all. I think that the best way to avoid working with stereotypes is to work with stereotypes. So it's best to start working to create your character. And even if you're falling into stereotype, into cliche, that's okay because you're learning. And that's by practicing that you really understand how to get away from the stereotype. So I think that it's okay at the beginning, and that's why it's very important to practice. Like any, you know, you wouldn't expect to go to a tennis class and suddenly be excellent, you know, playing tennis. It's the same thing, you know, like it's okay to make mistakes, and it's okay also to come up with very stereotypical character. And the key here is to practice and to also share your stories, because sometimes you might not see it, you might not see the stereotypes, but your, for example, classmates or your lecturer if you're studying, but it could also be your friends or even people on an online forum if you don't want to share, you know, with people that you know in person. They might help you to actually improve and to spot the mistake. So I think it's okay to start with what you know, as long as you push yourself to, you know, and you challenge yourself to create a new character every time. And maybe it might be helpful also, if you're struggling with a character, it might be helpful to start thinking about a certain setting first, and then placing a character in the setting. So if you're struggling with a personality, try to start with your setting, something that maybe it's new to you, you don't know, you've never heard of, you know, even in different countries, and you can research, for example, the country, and then you can create a character that fits into the specific setting, which is new and unknown to you. And that might help you also to unblock, you know, and to get over the issue of stereotypes, I think.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I don't know if there is anyone else who want to ask a question. If not, I think that Marta, if you
I couldn't find raise the hand.
So, don't worry.
I have a question. Thank you for your presentation first. And then I was thinking that you said the writer shouldn't limit it, as I understand, maybe correct, shouldn't limit the characters and should let them to speak. And on that time, I was thinking that if I am writer, they come from my mind. So how is it possible that, you know, they are in my mind and I want to do something? I have a setting, I have a story in my mind. So how can deal it with this one to make them free to talk, and on the other hand, I can follow the story. So if they are free to talk, I cannot follow the storyline that I have in my mind. Maybe I have to add some other characters. So it is in contrary to the first of the you're speaking that you said we should have the characters at the first. So I was wondering how I can do it. I tried to write something, but I never did it very well. But it was a question in my mind.
Thank you for your question. That's an excellent point. So I think the way I see it is this. So you're working on your characterization. So your aim is to build a believable personality, a believable being, whatever it is, animals, aliens, or human. Let's say a person, let's say it's a human. So you're creating a believable being, a believable human being, and then you're placing the human being in a setting, and then you're throwing obstacles at him, let's say, you know. The way your character will react has to agree with all the characterization work you've done before. So if you're creating a character and then while you're writing, you're thinking, oh, you know what, I want to, I don't know, I want my character to become the king of the world. I'm exaggerating here just to make a point. So you can't really do that if the ambition doesn't fit with your character personality. So you have to think that the ambition of your character and the choices that your character make will need to fit and to agree with the personality traits. It's like if you know somebody, like in real life, like a friend of yours, and somebody tells you, you know, he did this or he did that, and you're like, oh no, he would never do that. That's not him. That's not how he would act. So it's the same reaction, you know, like you have to think, would my character act in this way? Would my character do this? As much as you have friends that you know well, or your family members, and you know that they wouldn't do certain things because it's not in their personality, it's not in the way they're built, in the way they think. Their action just wouldn't work with them because you know them. So it's the same way. So yes, obviously you're creating the character, and obviously yes, you're letting your character talk. You're writing the pieces, so you are the sort of godlike being in this setting because you're creating your narrative. But you can't force your character to say certain things if it just doesn't agree with all the characterization work you've done earlier. I don't know if this kind of answers your questions or not.
Yes, to somehow, but I was wondering how really it is possible. It could be a very hard job for the writer to make this balance. Also, not just with the characters, I was thinking about all my ideas. As you know, everybody has the opinion and the way of thinking, and as a writer, I understood that you shouldn't follow your own, but you should think to different way of thinking, and how making this balance is really difficult, to be yourself and not to be yourself. You know, if I want to write as I am, all my stories should be the same. Like most of the writers that we see, or most of the TV series, or I don't know, these stories that we see, that they are the same, or they just talk about one subject. But in my opinion, the good writer that I really appreciate is that one that writes in a different ways. So it could be very difficult job for them. Thank you.
Thank you, and I agree with you. I mean, a good writer has to be an empathetic human being before being a writer. You have to be able to put yourself in other people's shoes, and you have to be, before being a good writer, you have to be, I think, very attentive person. You know, you have to train the eye by looking around you in your everyday life, you know, and trying to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. And that's why some of the best writers generally belongs also to minority groups. And unfortunately, maybe they're not some of the most famous writers, but some of the best writers belongs to minority groups and spoke for minorities because they were able to really see the issue from different perspectives, not only from the, you know, main focus of society, but also from the focus of minorities, and they are able to kind of yeah, to understand other people's viewpoints as well. But yeah, thank you for your question. It was really interesting as well.
Okay, perhaps now it's better to pass to the second part with the last two elements that you have to present, since we are approaching 8 o'clock. So if you want to share your screen again, we can go on. So obviously for everybody else, we still have time perhaps for some questions at the end of our meeting. There you go.
Can you see the screen?
Perfectly.
Excellent. Docs. So moving on to the next point of the day, point of view. So the point of view, it's another essential element, obviously, of your narrative. And it's essential because it really helps you to shape your narrative. Depending on the point of view that you choose, you can either provide or withhold information from your reader, which is key depending also on what type of fiction you're wanting to write. For example, if you want to build suspense in your fiction, you should definitely withhold information from the reader. And for all these reasons, it allows you really to build, to have a control over the representation of the events. And it is involved in the way you describe your events and in the way you develop your character as well. So you all know, obviously, the different types of point of view. So the first person point of view, second person, and third person. And we're going to briefly go through all of these just now. There you go. So the first person point of view, as you surely know, it's a character who is narrating from within the story. So obviously you'll have a partial and a subjective representation of the events because the character is implicated in most of the events. And the first person narrative is actually extremely useful, as you know, we were just talking there about the representation, for example, of minorities. The first person narrative is extremely useful for that because it allows the reader to relate to a different way of thinking, you know, to a different background, to a character who has a different background, different way of thinking, and a different experience. So it's very useful in the representation, for example, of minorities as well. The first person narratives, however, can also be used for to build an unreliable narrator, which is extremely useful if, for example, you're writing thriller fiction. And to build an unreliable narrator, all you have to do is basically push the mental state of your character to the extreme and then let your character narrate the story. And in this way, the story will be filtered by, you know, the different, it could be either the mental illness or it could be the evil goal of your character. So the extreme state of your character will misrepresent the events narrated through a first person narrative. When we're talking about when we're talking about unreliable narrator with a first person narrative, we can be talking about either deliberately deceptive narrator or unintentionally misguided narrator. So if we're talking about deliberately deceptive narrator, we are talking about characters who are misrepresenting the events to the reader, generally with the intention of lying for personal gain. So they're trying to hide their true intention and nature, and they're generally manipulative characters. An example of this is James Shepard, who narrates The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie, who, spoiler alert, is also the killer. And he tries to manipulate the narration so that you can't really, you don't think he's the killer, you don't understand, you know, that he's actually the evil character there. Unreliable narrator can also be unintentionally misguided, which means that they do not mean any harm. So this type of characters do not need any harm in the way they're retelling the story. They're usually, the narrated events are usually filtered by, for example, their lack of emotional maturity or by their mental health illnesses. So for example, a kid could be an unintentionally misguided narrator because he doesn't have the emotional maturity to understand the events. So he might represent the events in an ambiguous way, in an untruthful way. A reliable narrator can also be characters who are excessively playful, so exaggerated representation of the events, or they might be politically or religiously biased characters. And depending on their awareness of themselves, they can either be unintentionally misguided or deliberately deceptive. That depends on whether they understand that they're exaggerating or they're aware of their limits posed by these religious or political biases. And generally, as I said earlier, unreliable narrators are very useful if you're writing, for example, thriller fiction. They're also useful for some type of gothic fiction. They're useful also for crime fiction. So any type of fiction where you want to withhold some information from the reader and create suspense as well. With a reliable narrator, you're basically creating two or more versions of one story, because one is the story as you're presenting it to the reader. So the story, how the narrator, sorry, is presenting it to the reader. And then the second version, let's say, of the story is what the reader comes up with once he starts to detect the ambiguity in the way the narrator presents the events. So really the truth in a way is left to the reader's interpretation. But if you do want to create these, let's say, different versions of the one narrative, you have to put some hints and clues in your story. And that's why the unreliable narrator is extremely hard to work with. And I don't recommend you to start working with an unreliable narrator, because you have to be very skillful. You have to develop a strong voice, because it's still a first-person narrative. And at the same time, you have to build the ambiguity, which is really hard as well. And it requires quite a bit of confidence from the writer. There are also limitations to the first-person narrative in general, not just the unreliable narrator. Obviously, the narrator must be involved in most of the action, because obviously the reader will know what the narrator experienced or what the narrator knows. It's going to be much harder to give a physical description of the narrating character, and also give an objective opinion on the narrating character personality. And then you can't end with the narrator's death, sorry. I mean, you can, if you decide, for example, to build a narrative as a sort of like epistolary novel. So let's say that the narrative are actually letters written by your character before his death, or it could be a manuscript written by the character before his death, like in Edgar Allan Poe manuscript found in a bottle, where the character writes this manuscript before dying, and then basically the reader has the narration. But you know, you risk to fall into cliche here as well. So that's something that you have to keep in mind when you're working with it. Moving on to the second person narrative, or the so-called you perspective, it is definitely much rarer in literary fiction. It's not used as much, and it's mainly used in in creative nonfiction, such as, for example, in essays, in also advertisement pieces, which sometimes classifies, as I said earlier, as creative writing as well. And it's the perspective in which the narrator addresses an implied reader. So it basically constantly pulls the reader back into the narrative, and at the same time pushes the reader back as well. And it builds this sort of sense of familiarity because of the constant addressing of the reader. Very briefly, because as I said, it's not very common in literary fiction, there are some benefits and some limits in the use of the second person narrative. It's very useful to force the reader to reflect and reconsider the beliefs and opinion, because with the fact that he's addressing the reader directly, he's putting the reader on the spotlight, and the reader starts actually questioning their own belief, which is useful if you're writing essays, for example, no academic essays, just like creative writing, non-fiction essays, especially on social themes, because it forces the reader to reconsider the belief and start considering the beliefs of the theme and the themes expressed in the essay. And because it creates also intimacy between the narrator and the reader, it can also be used to add humor, which could be extremely useful. Also very useful if you are writing children's literature, children, for example, might like to be directly addressed by the use of you, by the narrator, because they still live in the beautiful part of life where you think you're the center of all, and it's amazing. So, in children's literature, the you perspective can really work and can really be effective. It is not as effective if you're working with adult fiction, because we are generally less used to see this type of perspective, and we're not generally used to be addressed by a narrator. And it's much harder to develop your character, it's much harder to describe the scenes, because you are constantly creating this sort of bridge between the narrative world and then the real world of the reader. So it becomes harder to handle everything. And you also risk that you risk that the readers might actually lose interest in the story if they simply don't like to be addressed and if they don't like the narrator. And the third person narrative is obviously the most versatile point of view. I definitely recommend you, if you're starting to write, we start with a third person narrative, because it's easier as to handle as a writing tool. And as you all know, obviously the third person narrative is an overarching voice, and it's the least embodied voice because it's not a character in the story. If you do choose to write with a third person narrative, you have to choose also the right third person narrator, because there are a lot of different types. You can have an omniscient narrator, a limited narrator, and then your third person narrator can also be objective or intrusive. So obviously you all know what an omniscient and limited narrator are. So the omniscient narrator is a godlike creature, so who knows everything, and everything that goes on, and it understands everything. It understands and knows the character motives for their action, and it really doesn't leave much to imagination. This could be very useful depending on what fiction you're writing, but again, if you're trying to write a fiction that involves the use of suspense and the withholding of information as a technique, you might not want to pick the omniscient narrator for your narrative. The limited narrator follows closely basically one of the characters and limit the information given to the reader by basically giving all the information. The limited narrator follows one of the characters very closely, kind of like the first person narrator. So all the reader knows is what the character knows. And then you have the objective and the intrusive narrator, in which the objective narrator basically prevents the events without actually expressing any personal opinion. And then the intrusive narrator, an example of this is the narrator in Jane Austen's novel, which generally presents judgments on the character and their action. And it's definitely harder to work with, because an intrusive narrator requires a certain amount of confidence from the writer, because you have to be able to handle a third person narrative and to insert at the same time judgment. So you have to have a bit of a more developed voice as a writer, I think, to use this. One last thing on the point of view is the fact that you could choose between using a locked point of view or change your point of view throughout the narrative. So the locked point of view obviously is a point of view locked onto one character. So for example, if you're working with an unreliable narrator, you're more likely going to work with a locked point of view. It's going to be locked to that specific character throughout the whole narrative. And it's a consistent and unbroken tone throughout the narrative. For example, Bartleby, The Trial, Lolita, those are all examples of locked point of view. If you decide to change point of view, which is probably best for you as a beginner to work with a locked point of view, but if you decide to change point of view, you need to be aware that, well, first of all, changing point of view means swapping viewpoints from one character perspective onto the other. And you can do this using the first person narrative, so moving from the I narrative of one character onto the I narrative of the other character. Or you could do this by using the third person limited narration. So you first follow one character with the third person, then you move on to the other character, and you move across in that way through the narrative. And it's definitely harder to work with, because all the different changes of point of view have to be detectable by the reader, have to be meaningful, and have to be well timed. So it requires a lot of good choreography and timing as well. As I said, if you do decide to change point of view, I strongly recommend you to start practicing with a third person narrator, because if you start with a first person narrator, you will need to create a very strong individual character voices, because if one of the voices of your narrators is less strong than the other, the reader will just lose interest. You have to choose the right time and place where you're going to swap the viewpoint. You can't just do it randomly. I strongly discourage you from changing every paragraph or changing many times throughout a section of your written piece, because it will become confusing for the reader. I recently read a book which I've never finished because the writer just keeps changing point of view throughout the chapter so many times that I just lost track of it and I could never finish it. So if you really want to change point of view, try to do it in meaningful moments, and just be aware that it's a danger point. So it's definitely best if you could to just start writing with a locked point of view and then practice with a changing point of view later on. And then if you feel like you're slipping into a different point of view of a different character while you're using a locked point of view, try instead to imply what the character is thinking and what the character wants by using dialogue or actions rather than actually changing point of view. Okay, so moving on to the next element of today, which is plotting. So we spoke about character, we spoke about setting, and we spoke about point of view, which are things that you can work with before actually getting to write. But then when you actually start to write, plotting is essential. So how you're going to develop your narrative. We spoke so much about narrative, but to develop your narrative, you need to write, and to write, you have to have plotting. You have to develop your plotting. So I think the first thing to do here is to explain, first of all, what a narrative is. So the narrative is defined as a series of events in a specific order, which can be connected either in time or by logical connection. And it's a representation of one or more events from a narrator onto an audience. And these events have to have some sort of overarching theme or subject in order to be a whole, to make sense, to be together. So what you first need to understand when you are building your narrative is that your narrative is made of two main elements that you have to consider as a reader. So it has a double structure, which is the story, so what it's narrated in your narrative, and then the discourse. So how basically the way you are narrating the story, so the narrating element. And I mean, that could be, we could have a full day just talking about these elements of the narrative. But I think that in terms of what the relevancy of these elements to a writer is that the writer needs to be aware that having a story is not enough. You also have to think how you're going to present this story. And you have to remember these two things are related, but at the same time are two completely different processes. So the story, as I said, is the narrated element. So it's what it's been narrated. So the events or the action they have occurred. While the discourse is the way these events are recounted. So the way they're told and the way they're organized in the telling. And you know, basically what this means is that it's not enough to have a great idea for a great story. You also have to know how to present the story well. And to present the story well, you as a writer have to work on your discourse, basically, on the way you're going to present it. The discourse is generally understood to be constituted by two main elements, which is the substance and the form. The substance being the medium of manifestation, in our case that we mean the written word, and the form being any elements that goes to constitute the way you're telling the story. So the narrative elements, the point of view, the order of events, the speed of presentation, the commentary, any of these elements involved in the actual telling action, in the telling of the story. So what does this mean? It means that one same story can be told using different discourses, creating different narrative, and equally one same type of discourse could be applied to different stories, also creating different narratives. And it also means that even if you have a great story, if you don't work on your discourse, you might not have a successful narrative. If you do have a great discourse, if you know how to handle well a story, even if the story is very simple, very poor, very basic, you might actually get a very successful narrative. So it's important to keep in mind that what happens, it's important, but how you're going to tell what happened is way more important. In creative writing handbook, you generally find the word plot, not really story and discourse. But the way plot is described is the arrangement of events to form a narrative. Or again, from the Dictionary of Narratology, Gerald Prince writes, the arrangement of incidents or the situation and events as presented to the receiver. So when we're talking about plot in the creative writing handbooks, we're kind of talking about how you're going to organize your discourse and how you're going to tell your story. So it's very much tied to the concept of discourse. And in fact, when we talk about good plotting as well in the creative writing handbooks, we read stuff like this. So good plotting is about managing events over time. And these events need not to be monumental. They just need to unravel sequentially, keeping true to the logic of your story. So again, you see here that the emphasis is not on the type of event and it's not on the story, but it's on the discourse. It's on how you're going to time these events and how you're going to handle them and unravel them and present them to your reader. Another thing that you have to keep in mind when you're developing your plot is that a plot can be also conceived as a sequence of questions that the reader is going to ask. So we said earlier that you have to work on your characterization and on your setting first, and then you can start to write. When you actually start to write, you can develop your plot. And when you're developing your plot, ask yourself in the different points of narrative, what would the reader ask in this situation? You know, what will the reader be asking the narrative as they read it? Try to predict this question, and try to address them either in the specific moment or later on in the narrative if you want to keep a bit of suspense and keep the dynamic a bit more interesting in your narrative. But this kind of shows you why it's fundamental to work on your elements before and keep your plotting and your writing quite flexible, because you will need to be flexible in order to address the needs as they come and in the reader question as they come. So this is not the best representation of the element of plot, to be honest. There are so many more representations that are much more interesting. This is just a very, very generalized list of elements of a plot. So obviously, to have a plot, you need to have an inciting incident, obviously, because you need an incident to activate the plot, something that happens that pushes your character to do something. And the inciting incident doesn't need to be at the beginning of the plot. It can also be later on. You could reveal the inciting incident to your readers through, for example, flashbacks. You need a protagonist or a character anyway, and you need all the characterization work that you've worked on before. So you need to know the goals, the aim, the purpose, and so on of your character, because it will be key to the plot. And you need to create some sort of obstacle, some sort of resistance. So you see here, we are mentioning again the elements that we mentioned when we talked about characterization at the beginning. And we are again looking at the dynamic that we saw before, in which the character action causes an event to happen, and at the same time an event causes a reaction in the character. And that's the dynamic that really goes to create your plot, as we said earlier. And yes, and obviously you need the resistance, you need to create obstacles, you need to have certain elements in your plot that allow you to challenge your character and to make your character push against and resistance and acts and move the story forward. Because really the character provokes the resistance provokes the character into making choices, which create conflict with at the same time activate the whole plot. And resistance comes in many, resistance can be anything, it can be the resistance against the self. So for example, the inner struggle of your character. It could be resistance against the others. It could be resistance against external factors, the society, the setting, as we saw earlier on. It could be supernatural powers. It could be the destiny of your character, so what the character is meant to achieve and fulfill in his life. And then one more thing about plotting is that, yes, obviously, as we've seen, basically we've gone a full circle here, because as we've seen, the character is key and the characterization is key to develop your plot. And to develop your plot means to develop your character arc as well, which might be a positive arc, a flat arc, or a negative arc, depending on the resolution at the end of your narrative. And to build strong character arcs, again, you have to keep in mind those three elements that we spoke about earlier: the desire, the fears, and the needs, and the conflict between what your character wants and what your character needs, because the conflict between the lie and the truth is what really will push your characters throughout the narrative and will push your character to make choices, and to challenge also, you know, the reality, their life and their beliefs as well. And yes, so remember that the character drives the plot and the plot molds the character arc, and they cannot work independently. So truly, it's fundamental to start with your character. And then just final advice, as I said earlier, practice, write as much as you can, as I was saying before during our short Q&A. Make sure to train the eye, which means observe the world around you, and try to understand, you know, and see things that nobody else sees. Try to look where nobody else is looking. Share your stories, because if you write, you have to write for an audience. If you don't share your story, it doesn't count. And if you don't share your story, you don't really learn from constructive criticism. So it's really important to share and to learn from others. And finally, read as much as you can, basically. I'm going to leave anyway the slides with Leonardo, and there are some creative writing handbooks. If you're interested, you can find them online, and you can, yes, buy them. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Marta. And as you said, you will leave me all the slides, and the slides will be available from tomorrow for everybody who partook to this meeting. If for any reason you do not receive the mail, please you can email transitions, or if you have my email address, you can do that as well. We have a few minutes left. If anybody has a questions or two, and I wanted also to leave in the chat, if you never went there, I'll leave you this little link, which is the link to the WordPress site of Transition Postgraduate Journal, if you want to see, if you want to have more information about the project. But anyway, if anybody wants to say anything, to ask anything, please, you can just unmute yourself or raise your hand, a smoke signal, whatever you want, a pigeon, I don't know.
I'm sorry, I don't know how to raise my hand, so can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Okay, so I have a question for the setting of the story, because I usually have problem with an interior struggle between the fictional set and the real set. I am aware if I chose a real set, there are geographical or historical and cultural implications that I cannot avoid, and that probably would affect my characters. So I would prefer to avoid this kind of set, but I also think that a realistic set would be more believable for my reader. So I cannot decide, and I would ask if there are is there any exercise to understand which kind of set could be or suitable for the story, for the plot, for the character, because there are a lot of characters, so maybe one set could be better for one kind of character and one not. And I don't know how to decide this.
Thank you for your question, first of all. I can't really tell you, because it depends on what you want to write. Again, we're going back to the idea of, you know, tradition, literary tradition. So depending on what you are trying to write, depending on the style, on the genre, what I would recommend you to do is to read books that are, or stories or whatever it is, written in the genre, in the tradition, and to kind of study first what others have done. And that could help you to understand what might work for you. Because obviously yes, if you are writing in a real life setting, so in our society, you always have to deal with social, historical, and political implication. But then again, if you're writing in a fictional setting, in a either in a fantasy setting or even in a fictional city, which kind of looks like ours, there will be social and political and historical implication there as well. Obviously you can make those up. You don't have to do the historical research that you would have to do if, for example, you're writing in a real setting. So you're a bit more in control of those elements and how you want these elements to interact with your character. But my first advice is when you are in doubt, go back to read. So I think that when you're in doubt and when you don't know what could work, look at what worked in the past, and not just in the past, but also like in contemporary fiction. Maybe try to find something that could fit in your idea of genre, your idea of fiction that you want to achieve, and see if any of this works. And then work with the imaginative sketching that we talked about earlier. So try to write a few paragraphs. So you don't need to commit fully to the setting. You can kind of just take a setting on trial and just write a few paragraphs, trying different settings with your characters and see what works best. I hope that kind of answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
So we are approaching 8:30. So obviously, if anybody has to go, it's okay. Just remember, for those that will attend the second session, that it is necessary to read Bartleby before the session, not during it. So if you have to go, again, no problem. But if you have any other question and Marta doesn't have to go, I don't know, obviously up to her, please, again, anything from smoke signals to just unmute yourself and ask the question.
I have to go, unfortunately, but I just wanted to, thank Marta for this really comprehensive introduction to all the features of writing, especially narrative. And of course, simply notice how a lot of the things that she said actually overlap with, what would have been a class in, narratology, or, a lot of these things, overlap with things that we learn when, we read Mikabal or, Jeanette, or, many of the other narratologists, or, students of narrative. But I also want to leave with, this obviously not meant as a, as a provocation in any way, but, these rules are important. But by these rules, Herman Melville would have failed miserably in, a creative writing program, and he would have never written, Moby Dick. He wouldn't have never written Bartleby. He would never have written Pierre and many of the, or The Confidence Man. In other words, these rules are there, but, I think, you have to master them in order to be able to break them. And of course, this is where the difference between the artist, who wants to be, a writer of excellence, and someone who wants to master the art of writing. That's where I think the difference lies. And it's the same thing in any sport, in any field. If you train a kid to play soccer, which I have some experience with, you don't try to teach him to play like Maradona or like Francesco Dotti. Never. You never do that. You teach him the basics. You teach him how to be a regular soccer player. Then these players do things that other players never do, because they don't know how to do them, because they are, basically against the law of physics almost. It's the same thing. Bartleby is a character that comes out of nowhere. He doesn't match any of those, descriptions that are we're given to how to construct the character. He's a mystery. He's a big question mark. And of course, he's interesting precisely because he violates all our expectations. So this is, I suppose, just as an encouragement to people, you know, if you can't really be that good, don't worry. You know, you might be a genius and you might not know it. So, you know, part of the fun of creative writing is also to let yourself go, especially if you're not doing it professionally. Of course, you know, if you want to, you know, reach a certain level, then of course I completely agree. You have to master all those principles that Marta so very well explained. But you know, sorry, I think it was really interesting, and you know, it's always nice for someone who, you know, teaches at university to see that students are, you know, or young people are just willing to take 2 hours of their time to devote to these things just because they like them, just for the fun of it, just because, you know, just like Marta, I'm afraid she's not getting paid for what she did, but, you know, she should have been paid. You know, all we can say that maybe, you know, if she comes to Rome at any point, we'll take her out for dinner. But, you know, but it's really, you know, uplifting to see that there are so many young people intelligent and passionate about these subjects. It's really nice. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this and for being here today as well. And, you know, that I agree with many of the things that you said just now. Obviously, what makes an artist is the ability to break the rules. So yeah, we'll do our best. We try to study creative writing and then see if we study enough to actually break everything we studied and make new rules. But thank you for the nice words.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. And good luck with you know, with these conversations. You know, I'll be happy to, you know, come again.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye, good evening. Well, I will also say that our time is, I would say, is up. I think that was a great presentation by Marta. Thank you again to have come here.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope you don't get sick of hearing my voice after 2 hours, but you know, it was fun to prepare the presentation. It was fun to have this conversation, especially with such a different environment like the Italian environment, for example, an academic environment. So yeah, thank you for having me.
So for everybody, as I mentioned earlier, we have the second session, the 28th. For any reason you have, please email transitions. You should have received an email, so it should be quite easy to answer that. And again, good evening to everybody. Have a nice dinner, have a nice everything. See you the 28th.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming. See you on the 28th.
Thank you. It was really interesting.
Thanks.
Thank you.